Hi everyone, welcome to my WVD Automation Adventure presentation. My name is Esther Bartel and I've been a technical consultant for over 20 years in the end-user computing industry, designing, implementing and troubleshooting virtual desktop environments. Some of you may also know me from the different community programs that I'm actively involved in, like Citrix Technology Professionals, Microsoft MVP, and the Women in Tech Mentorship Program. For the last couple of years, my focus has been mainly on DevOps and automation, automating Windows and Citrix infrastructure deployments, configurations, and management activities, using REST API, JSON, and my favorite scripting language, PowerShell. Today I want to take you along my Windows Virtual Desktop adventure, discovering different Azure services to help and maintain my automation workflows, using ARM templates, Azure Automation, and Azure DevOps. If we're talking about Windows Virtual Desktop, or at least if I'm talking about Windows Virtual Desktop within this presentation, I'm mainly focused on what's in your control within your subscription. So I'm talking about full desktops and remote apps and management and policies of those. Relating that to Windows Virtual Desktop, it means that this presentation will mostly focus on the host pool and its configuration of session hosts, application groups, and applications. Also, I want you to be aware of the fact that before we can start creating our host pool within WVD, there are a couple of prerequisites that you need to take into account. And I've already listed the basic steps that are required. So you need to have a virtual network, a domain controller. You need to have AD connects and configure synchronization rules. Make sure that you have a DNS server configured on your VNet so your virtual machines can communicate and join that domain. And of course, according to best practices, make sure that you configure a management server with all the snap-in tools. And one of the things that is very important right now is that virtual machines cannot be Azure AD joined yet. So if we're talking about domain joining virtual machines, we're talking about standard domain joined or hybrid AD joined. So diving into the create a host pool process for WVD. So if we go to the Azure portal, go to WVD, we can simply click on host pools, click on the add or create a host pool button to get started with the create a host pool process. And this means that we are now basically asking Azure Resource Manager to deploy a host pool for us, creating different objects within Azure. And in order to do that, the Azure Resource Manager has a couple of questions for us, so to speak, because we need to provide some information. For instance, we need to make a decision on what kind of host pool type we are gonna deploy, either personal or pooled. We need to specify the load balancing algorithm. If we're talking about virtual machines and auto-creating the desired virtual machines within our host pool, within this process, we also need to specify a virtual machine size. And this can be any size that is available within your region. We also need to specify an image type and make a selection or select our image. For demo purposes, it will mostly be focusing on the gallery and the images that Microsoft provides. But you can also specify your own custom images hosted in your shared image gallery. As mentioned before, with the WVD prerequisites, we also need to specify a virtual network. And make sure that this is a virtual network that has a DNS server configured that helps your virtual machine to resolve your domain controller and be able to get domain joined. And of course, for the domain join process, we need to specify the domain and the credentials to make sure that that can be performed by the Azure Resource Manager. Each host pool also has a workspace. So you can either link it to a workspace that you already created or use this option to create a workspace for this host pool. And with every Azure resource, you can also use tags to make sure that you can quickly find your resources within Azure. And finally, we get to the review and create step of the process. If validation is passed, which means that the Azure Resource Manager has ensured that it has all the information it needs to start the deployment, we can hit that create button and create our host pool and all the linked objects within Azure. And I don't know about you, but when I did this the first time within Azure, it kind of felt like a lot of manual steps. So this basically is where my adventure started in trying to figure out how to automate this deployment process. So fortunate for me, one of the first hits that I got is that Azure offers you the option to use ARM templates. And Azure Resource Manager templates, written in JSON, allows you to automate the deployment and still provide the Azure Resource Manager with all the information that it needs. As mentioned, it's based on JSON. So for this presentation, I wanted to make sure that we all have our basic JSON knowledge at the get-go. So here are some of the syntax rules for JSON. Data is always shown in name-value pairs. It's separated by commas. We use curly braces to hold objects and square brackets to hold arrays. And of course, it wouldn't be a lot of fun if we couldn't mix and match it all together to build more complex JSON objects. Returning to ARM templates. ARM templates use a couple of predefined sections, so to speak. First of all, schema, which basically is the definition of the schema that is being used by the template. Content version is for your own versioning purposes, so feel free to use any versioning formatting that you prefer. Parameters, that's the section where you specify all the input information that your template needs. Variables is the section where you can specify your own variables to be used within the template. And this allows you to basically concat information or shorten some of the reference paths. You can also use your own functions by defining those within the function section. But the best part of the template, of course, is the resources section, where you define each and every Azure resource that you want to create, that you want to be created by the Azure Resource Manager. And to make sure that there's also an option to return some information after the deployment has been successful, there's also an output section that allows you to specify all the output that you want your template to return. Please do not feel discouraged if this is not very readable right now. This is just an example that Microsoft also provides as a basic template for your ARM template. So it doesn't contain any information yet, but already it kind of discouraged me because it made me realize that building your own ARM template from scratch might not be as easy as I was hoping it to be. So the good news is that I quickly discovered a quick start guide on Microsoft documentation that basically guides you through all the steps that you need to perform to create and deploy your ARM template using the Azure portal. So the quick start guide explains that you can go to the create a resource section, select whatever resource you want to deploy from your marketplace, and then go through all the different steps where you provide the information that your Azure Resource Manager needs. And I know this screen still will look very familiar to those of you that paid some attention to the first part of this presentation. So instead of hitting that create button, I'm now gonna hit a download a template for automation link at the bottom of the screen. And this link brings me to a download page that basically allows me to download the ARM template and the parameters file for that template directly from the Azure Resource Manager. And the cool part is that the template that you download already has all those sections pre-filled based on the information that you provided to Azure Resource Manager in the previous steps. So all the parameters are already in place, including all the variables and resource definitions that you need to deploy that deployment in an automated way. So this definitely helps you to make sure that you can quickly start with a custom ARM template. And if you want to further customize your template, feel free to check out the ARM Templates reference guide, because this holds detailed information on each and every resource that you can create with the Azure Resource Manager, including virtual network configurations. And it starts by giving you a template format. So you can already copy and paste this into your own template and make sure that you have all the information. And if you have any questions on any of the properties that you can specify for the resource, these are all explained in details as well. So it shows you that you have your properties. That, for instance, what different properties that you can select, for instance, DHCP options, and detailed within those DHCP options, for instance, your DNS server. That allows you to specify the DNS server that is linked to your virtual network, one of the prerequisites for WVD. And with all the information in the reference guide, you can quickly build your own edition or customize that downloaded ARM template even further. If this process might not help you directly because it might be a bit more complex than just deploying a virtual machine or just creating a host pool, there's also an entire library of pre-configured ARM templates with almost 900 templates to choose from. So the chances are pretty high that the template that you are looking or are trying to build already has an example within this library. So feel free to check it out. And if we're talking about WVD templates, there's a lot of community activity right now that has WVD specific templates hosted in a GitHub repository. So feel free to check that one out as well and see if that already has the templates that you are looking for. So now that I have shown you how to quickly create your own template, it is time to talk about the next step. How are we going to use this template to start an automated deployment or to even start a deployment within Azure? Well, the cool part is that Azure offers a template service, and this service allows you to build your own custom ARM template library. And this library does not only offer the option to edit your templates, but it also has this quick button that allows you to start a deployment based on your template. And what it does is that it posts this template or uses that template and pushes it to your Azure Resource Manager to get started with a deployment. And even though this screen kind of looks similar than the screens that the marketplace shows you, the cool part about using your custom ARM template is that you can already have a lot of these boxes pre-filled with default values that you specify within your template. So that means that for this custom deployment, I only need to specify a resource group and my administrator account password. And scroll all the way down to the bottom to agree to the terms and conditions and hit that purchase button to get started with my deployment. So just to make it more visual, I pre-recorded this quick demo filling out my administrator account password, scrolling down to the bottom where you can now see that a lot of the fields are already pre-filled, so it is a faster way than going through the marketplace each and every time. And with the pre-filled option, I already make sure that it has a consistent result with each and every deployment. So the deployment is automatically started after the template is validated, and you can follow each and every step within the progress. And I kind of fast forwarded through this deployment to make sure that we're not staring at the same screen for like 10 minutes. So what it's showing right now is that the virtual machine that is going to be my session host within my host pool is deployed. It's joined to the domain, which is one of the automated actions within the template. And I'm just going to quickly switch to the domain controller to double check if it's actually added to the domain or joined to the domain. And as you can see, it is. So going back to my deployment, we're now seeing that there's one final step, adding some extensions to the session host. And finally, my deployment is complete. So if we now go back to Windows Virtual Desktop to the configuration and check our host pool, where previous there was no host pool configured, it now has my host pool configuration as specified through the ARM template, including the session host that I specified and we saw was joined to the domain in the previously step. So this already offers a nice way to use your own customization and to make sure that you get consistent results when deploying WVD host pools. But it still felt like there were a couple of manual steps that I wanted to be able to automate even further. So turning back to my favorite scripting language, I discovered that there's a PowerShell module for Azure, AZ. And you can easily install this PowerShell module from the PowerShell gallery using the install module commandlet. And what you'll notice is that once it has that module installed, if you check out any of the, it does install some additional AZ modules or submodules as well, including the AZ Desktop Virtualization module, which contains all your WVD based commandlets. And of course, there's a cool reference guide that will help you get detailed information on each and every commandlet and how to use it, providing different examples. So getting started with PowerShell and communicating with Azure, of course, the first step is that I need to authenticate myself against Azure. So Azure knows which subscription I want to perform some actions on. Using the login AZ account, as Microsoft suggests, is a good start, but it still has an interactive component because it gives a pop-up window that asks you to sign into your Microsoft Azure account. This is not the best approach for a fully automated, non-interactive script. So I discovered that in order to use automated script against Azure, it's very smart to use a service principal. So what you can do if we're talking about service principals is go to your Azure Active Directory, go to App Registrations and add a new application registration. And this new registration provides you with an application ID. It also shows your directory ID or tenant ID. Make sure that you write those down or you lock those so we can use them later on. And for your application ID, it is also smart to create a secret, because this allows me to use it for authentication against Azure. And this secret that you create only is shown at the first time to copy the information. Afterwards, it will stay hidden within the portal. So if you lose your secret, you will have to create a new one to make sure that you can keep using your app ID account. So with that 3 pieces of information, my application ID and application key, I can use those 2 to create a credentials object within PowerShell. And I'll use my tenant ID information with the connect AZ account commandlet. Together with the credentials I just created and the extra parameter service principal, I can now use this to have a non-interactive communication with or authentication with Azure and be able to use any additional commandlet to automate my deployments and resource management from PowerShell to Azure. So I quickly can create a session to Azure and start using different commandlets. For instance, the new AZ resource group deployment commandlet. And this is the commandlet that addresses my Azure Resource Manager and provides it with an ARM template, just with the manual steps or hitting that deploy button in the template service. So with an ARM template and an ARM template parameters file, I can now use that new AZ resource group deployment, specifying the resource group that I want my deployment to be started in, to automate a deployment within Azure. In my case, creating a new host pool with the WVD HP2 name. As you can see, I turned on verbose logging to make sure that I can keep track of the deployment process, because previously I already discovered that it takes about 10 minutes for the deployment to be completed. And the cool part about the new AZ resource group deployment commandlet is that it also gives some output once the process is completed. So it will return the provisioning state, either succeeded or failed. Fortunately for me, it now states succeeded. but it will also give you the parameters that were provided. And these are the parameters that it read from the parameter file. And this will help you in case the provisioning state is failed and you need to do some troubleshooting. One of the parameters that I specified was the host pool name, which was WVD host pool 2. And going back to Azure, I now have an additional host pool in my configuration with the number 2 that has one session host as was specified within my Azure Resource Template parameters file. So I finally found a cool way to automate my Azure or WVD deployment. But still, it didn't feel like I was using the full potential or using any specific Azure services with this. I still basically have a standalone or management machine that needs to run that PowerShell script. And that machine is also dependent on having all the modules that I use within PowerShell installed on it locally. So there are some dependencies, and it still doesn't allow me any current DevOps methods for versioning or source control. So the next step for me was to check out Azure Automation. And the reason why I started with Azure Automation is because it allows me to use PowerShell runbooks. So this means that I can easily port that PowerShell script that I just created and port it to a fully supported Azure service that will automate the workflow within that PowerShell script. And the other cool thing is that I can specify some additional configurations for my automation account. So I can already pre-configure all the modules that I need to be available for my PowerShell script. So I no longer have to use an agent that, or no longer have to install the modules and add that to my PowerShell script. It's already pre-configured in my automation account, as well as having the option to pre-configure credentials and variables. So this allows me to make some slight modifications to my PowerShell runbook for a more secure and more automated way of work. So I can easily go to my runbook and hit start to get it started. And in some cases it will ask for parameters. And I will show you in a second that these parameters are specified within my PowerShell script. These are not parameters that my ARM template is asking for. The other thing that I need to specify is whether or not I want to run this runbook in Azure or a hybrid worker. If we're talking about Azure, then it will spin up an agent and from an Azure pool and run my runbook on it or run my script on it. If I specify a hybrid worker, this is a controlled and managed machine that is in my control and managed by me, that allows me to maybe add additional resources to it that I can link to from the scripts. In my case, I want to go as serverless as possible, so I'm using Azure and hitting OK to get started with my runbook. So as I mentioned, I made some modifications to the PowerShell script that I previously shown. The first thing mentioned was parameters. So this allows me to build in some more flexibility into the runbook. The other thing is that I'm now using automation variables and automation credentials to get those secrets, to import the secrets into my script. And then I can still use that non-interactive connect AZ account commandlet to build my session to Azure and to be authenticated. And the section that does the deployment, the ARM deployment, is basically almost the same, except for the fact that I'm now using a storage account for the location of my ARM template and my parameters file. But still, I'm using the new AZ resource group deployment commandlet to start my ARM deployment. And what you'll see in the next demo is that instead of creating a new host pool, which I already demoed in the previous one, I'm now using a different ARM template that allows me to add additional session hosts to an existing host pool. In this case, I'm using the host pool created in the first demo that has one session host. And I'm gonna add one additional session host to it in the demo. So if I start my runbook, provide it with the parameters, select to run it on Azure, and hit OK, the runbook will be started. Or better yet, it will be queued, as you can see from the status message. And then once it's picked up, it will change the status from starting to running. And you can check all the console output that your script generates by clicking on the Output tab and using refresh to make sure that you get the latest information. So now the deployment is already started by my runbook. Going back to Azure, to my resource group, I can double check that this deployment is started. And you'll notice that it now says update host because it's updating an existing host pool by adding an additional session host. So it has to create that machine again, join that new VM to the domain, install those additional extensions, and then add it to the host pool. So as you can see, the deployment is fast forwarded once again because I didn't want to stare at the screen for too long. If I go back to my automation account, go back to my runbook, you'll notice that it now says that one of the recent jobs was completed. So going back and looking at the output, you'll notice that it once again has that same deployment output. So first of all, it returned the provisioning state. Luckily, it succeeded again. It returned the parameters. And scrolling all the way down, it also returned some output, like the name of the session host in this case. And please be aware of the fact that you always can check errors, warnings, and all the log information for your runbook. Going back to Windows Virtual Desktop to the host pools, going back to that original host pool that had one session host, we now see that it has a second session host with the name that was also in the output of the deployment. So I guess this finally helped me finish that quest that I had to be able to fully automate an Azure deployment, especially a Windows Virtual Desktop host pool deployment. And I do know that there are different arguments for pros and cons for Azure Automation in comparison to Azure DevOps that for this presentation I didn't want to dive into right now. Because I think depending on the functional requirements that your customer has, there is one of those two solutions that will definitely help you to automate those deployments. So I wanted to include both Azure Automation and Azure DevOps as a valid option for your WVD deployment automations. So lastly, in this presentation, I wanted to show you some of the basic steps to get you started with Azure DevOps and automation. And the one thing that definitely kickstarts my adventure in Azure DevOps was a blog post by Tom Hickling, one of our WVD global black belts. And he created this awesome post about deploying Windows Virtual Desktop host pool using Azure DevOps from an infrastructure background. And that, of course, related best to me because I'm still struggling with some of the developer tooling and methodologies that are being used within DevOps. The ops is still strong in this one. Going to Azure DevOps, even though Tom's article has also great pointers on how to build a complete CI/CD pipeline, I just wanted to focus for this presentation on a quick start with the releases only. So I'm not going to zoom in on how to build your image and then automatically release it. I'm just going to show you how to release, how to use a release pipeline to automate your ARM deployment. There's a built-in task for that. To make your life easy, which basically just allows you to use a template link or a URL to your ARM template that will be imported by the task. And you can also override your template parameters, specifying, for instance, or using even variables from Azure DevOps in your override command, so to speak. And the thing you need to know about pipeline variables is that there are two different variable group types. The first one is defining your variables within Azure DevOps itself. So that means that you cannot reuse those same variables outside of Azure DevOps. The other option is to link your variables group to an Azure key vault and basically import all the variables that are specified within your key vault. So without ever knowing the secrets, I can still use them and have a centralized management of all the secrets that I use within my organization. Going back to my release pipeline, so zooming in on a release, as I mentioned, it now has one built-in task. So what I wanted to do is show you a quick demo of adding another virtual machine to a host pool. And for this demo purposes, I'm using the same host pool as I did previously, but I removed that second session host. So we're starting off with the WVD HP host pool with only one session host and using this release pipeline to add a second session host to the host pool. So making sure that I add a sensible description to my release. When I hit create, my release is being queued. And I can now zoom in on all the different stages that are specified within my release. So as you can see, it changed from queue to in process, meaning that the first job will always be to initialize the agent before it gets started with all the jobs that I specified. In this case, ARM template deployment. And as you can see, it is already starting that deployment. And the template also specified the deployment name that is being used. So this makes it easy to go back to my resource group and check out the progress of that deployment. And you've already seen this screen a couple of times where I tell you that it's deploying the session host, adding it to the domain, and then running some extensions. So I figured it would be more fun to look at the progress in Azure DevOps, but that's not as exciting as well. So I fast forwarded to the final stage where it says that everything succeeded. And the cool part about Azure DevOps is that you can always zoom in on the jobs that were performed and make sure, double check whether they were successful or not. So hopefully with this presentation, I've given you insights into some of the Azure services that are available out there for automating your WVD deployments. Both using Azure Automation or even PowerShell scripts within your own orchestration and automation tools, or maybe even adapting Azure DevOps to build a complete CI/CD pipelines that will help you to quickly get your WVD environments up and running, and even quickly implement changes to images and other configurations. So for me, the adventure is still going on, even though I already had some pretty cool encounters on the road to other cool Azure services. I think there are still a couple of tasks for me to explore. For instance, one of the things that I mentioned previously is that I'm not too comfortable with the module dependencies that PowerShell has. So my first step is, and I'm already working on this, is converting those PowerShell AZ commandlets to native REST API calls, because that will give me more flexibility from my automation tooling to automate my deployments without having to deal with prerequisites or any other considerations. And the other thing, the big elephant in the room, so to speak, that we haven't addressed yet is custom images. So if I want to make sure that I automate building custom images as well, I figured it would be a lot of fun to dive into all the options and adventures that Azure Image Builder and the shared image gallery can provide. So be on the lookout for any cool information and experience that I'm encountering with those quests. For those of you that are really excited about adapting some automation methods for WVD, I built a small, what I like to call starter kit for WVD automation. So I made sure that I registered a GitHub repository that is free to use for the community, that will hold all the scripts that were used for demo purposes, but also will show you all the progress that I'm making with native REST API scripts, offering you pre-configuration files for Postman, for instance. So if there are any questions, feel free to reach out to me through social media. If you want to help and contribute to the GitHub repository, I really welcome any help and any new insights. And I'll make sure to stick around in the chat if there are any immediate questions based on this presentation. So the only thing that is left for me to say is thank you and have a great Microsoft Meets community rest of your day.